There it goes. All
You
right.
seeing the proper screen,
Yes.
right? Not presented.
Yes.
Awesome sauce. Okay.
Nice drawings.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Julia Mahood. I'm a master beekeeper in Atlanta, Georgia, where it's 10 p.m., but I will try not to yawn. And I'm going to talk to y'all tonight about my favorite type of honeybee, which is the drone. I like to say that drones are the Rodney Dangerfields of the bee world. They get no respect. And what you all probably know about drones, you probably know the basics. They're the male bees, right? And that they have only one job, and that's to mate with other queens, and that they don't contribute in any discernible way to the survival of the colony. And that's kind of what you get told, you know, at your Beekeeping 101 course. And you hear sometimes that they're freeloaders and they're a drain on your colony's resources. However, if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that drones are actually fascinating. They're really integral to the colony, and I hope you'll learn to appreciate these little black sheep by the time my talk is over. So we all know what's in a hive. A booming hive in spring typically will have one queen, about 60,000 workers if they're doing great, and 2,000 to 6,000 drones. And this is our handsome drone on the left, and a couple of his worker sisters. And they really do look like this because drones only live 22 to 32 days. We all know what happens to drones in the winter, and if you don't know, I'm going to tell you in a minute, but they're always young and handsome. That's what they look like to the bees. But before we talk about drones specifically, I wanted to just go over some colony basics that have to do with drones. So in order to survive, we all know a colony has to be queen right? That's the most important thing. And then they have to have lots of workers. The queen can't survive without the workers, and vice versa. And they have to have food. So these things are sort of the bare minimum for survival of a single colony. But what about the colony as the superorganism? You know, the superorganism is when there are individual organisms that have specialized behavior that together create one organism, and the honeybee superorganism is the colony. If you think about humans, we need food, shelter, and water to survive, right, as individuals, but as a species, we have to reproduce to ensure survival. So in a similar fashion, in order for colonies, in order for the superorganism to reproduce, they have to have drones. And in the superorganism model, you'll often hear that the queen is the ovaries, the brain is the collective decision-making power of the workers, the comb is the liver, and the drones are the flying testes of the superorganism. And I could have drawn that differently, and I didn't, and you are welcome. So in order for bees to reproduce on the colony level, the worker honeybees have to raise drones. They have a biological drive to raise drones and to have their colony be drone right. You know, we often speak of colonies being queen right? Well, it's also really important that they be drone right as well. But you need to always keep in mind that colonies won't raise drones if they can't afford them. In weak, struggling colonies, the workers, they won't marshal their queen into larger cells. And if the queen does lay some drone eggs and larvae, the workers will cull them and get rid of them. So they won't support drones that they can't afford. So it's really like a sign of prosperity if a colony can afford to raise drones, right? I have a nuke that I overwintered, and I just put it into a bigger colony, and I kind of expected them to be bursting from the seams, but they weren't. And they were, you know, pretty conservative in their buildup, and they didn't have a single drone cell. Whereas my other colonies that are booming right now, they have lots of drone cells. So they are monitoring it constantly. So if they're doing great and they can afford them, I like to think of it like bees, the workers have their trophy husbands, right? So if we can indulge in some anthropomorphizing, like they're out on the flowers boasting about how many drones they can support, because it's a sign of strength and vigor when they can raise drones. So back to the general thinking about how drones are a drain on the colony for the average beekeeper. There was a study done in Scotland in the 1980s, I believe, that compared colonies that were given drone comb in the beginning of the season and those that weren't. And at the end of the season, the drone right colonies were larger, and they made slightly more honey than the colonies that weren't, which is kind of mind-boggling. And of course, there's also a study by Dr. Seeley that said that the colonies that had more drone comb didn't make as much honey as the colonies that had drone comb did not make quite as much honey. So, you know, as it always is in beekeeping, you can find conflicting research, but we do know that it's definitely not clear cut, right? So it contributes to their overall health to let them have some drone comb. So when we talk about drones, we're going to begin in the beginning. And with drones, life begins in a proper cell. Drones are larger and they need a bigger crib. So what happens every time the queen lays an egg, she first puts her head into the cell and she feels around with her front legs to see how big the cell is. And then she pulls her head out, turns around, inserts her abdomen, and lays an egg. So if she felt that the cell was on the small side, so 4.5 to 5 millimeters to 5.5 millimeters, she will lay an egg that will become a female, which means that she releases an egg from her oviduct. And as it comes down around the valve fold, her spermatheca releases some sperm that will fertilize that egg. And then she will deposit the egg via her sting chamber into the back of a cell. Now, what happens if she feels that the cell is larger, if it's around 6 millimeters or larger, when that egg comes down, the spermatheca does not release any sperm, and she lays an egg and it becomes a drone. So drones come from unfertilized eggs. And we know that this is the method, that it's her front legs, because researchers clipped the front legs off of queens, and they found that the queens without the front legs sort of laid willy-nilly fertilized and unfertilized eggs, and it had with no regard to the cell size. So that's how they figured out that mechanism. Those poor queens, right? So drones come from unfertilized egg. They don't have fathers, and they have only one set of chromosomes. And this is true of all Hymenoptera, of bees and wasps. And they're called haploids. Haploids have one set of chromosomes. Workers and queens are diploid. They have two sets of chromosomes. And there is such a thing as a diploid drone. It's a result of inbreeding, because honeybees have, they don't have a sex chromosome like humans do, the X and the Y. They have a allele on a gene, and there are, I think, 87 known sex alleles. Some of the old books say there's like 17, but they've discovered 87, and they think there's as many as 115. So what happens is, if a drone, if the egg was fertilized, but both the mother and the father had the same sex allele, say they both had the magic number 20, then you will get a diploid drone. So it's a 32 chromosome drone, and these individuals are unhealthy. They really aren't ever raised to emergence in the nest. You can raise them in the lab, and the ones that are raised in the lab are small, and they have and they're sterile, so they're really no good. But what happens is that those diploid drones give off a particular odor, and their cuticular compounds have a specific odor, and the nurse bees can smell it, and while they're larvae, and they eat them. So nothing is wasted, right? So when I do talks to children's groups, I often talk about how sweet and gentle honeybees are, and how they don't want to sting you. They die when they sting you, and how they're mean cousins. The wasps can sting you multiple times, and how the honeybees are gentle vegetarians, and the wasps are evil carnivorous beings. But the truth is that honeybees are gentle vegetarians, except for when they are cannibals. But we don't tell the kids that. And I actually don't really diss wasps, because I know they have their place in the ecosystem. So I'm not quite that bad. Okay, anyway, what you see when queens are laying diploid drones is this shotgun brood pattern, right? You've heard that term, and this is what it looks like. And this is a sign that a queen needs to be replaced, because she's laying too much inbred drone. And for your larvae, for you new people, if you just see a few holes here and there, it's not a big deal. That's good. That's signs of, it can be signs of what's the word? Varroa sensitive hygiene, where they're smelling out the cells that have Bro in it. But if it's like this, if it's about half of the brood being pulled out, then that is a sign of inbreeding. Okay, so because drones only have one set of chromosomes, you can often see recessive genes expressed. And in honeybees, the dominant eye color gene is black. So you'll see white-eyed drones. These poor fellows are blind and they never make it out. But you also see like these tan, beige, and sort of cherry-colored eyed drones. So that's one kind of interesting thing about drones. Okay, so we have haploid drone eggs in larger cells. And when you're first learning about bees, you're taught that all larvae are fed royal jelly for the first few days, right? Well, it's a tad more complex than that. Workers actually feed the 3 different larvae 3 different jellies, and they're fed in different amounts. Worker jelly and drone jelly, royal jelly, worker jelly, and drone jelly. And like the diet of worker larvae, the drone's diet changes the last few days when they're fed less jelly and more pollen and honey. So they get more carbs and sort of different vitamins and amino acids. But the biggest difference is in the amount of food the drone larvae get. They're bigger bees and they need more food, not unlike teenage humans. So drones are fed more, they're bigger than workers, and they need some extra time to grow into adults. And y'all probably familiar with this type of chart showing the pupation times. Everybody's an egg for 3 days, right? But workers are larvae for about 5 days, 5 to 6, queens for 4, and drones for 7 to 8. These numbers, and so the next is the pupal stage, and the total time from egg to adult for workers is 21, queens is 16, and drones is 24. And these numbers are important to know, but they're actually not set in stone. And there are 2 factors that weigh heavily on the developmental times. If the temperature in the brood nest is too low, or if the larvae don't get enough food, then the larval and pupal times can be much longer. So for drones, it can actually take up to 28 days, for workers up to 24, and for queens up to 17. So it all has to do with food and temperature. And now studies show that total larval and pupal survival rates are higher for workers than drones, and it probably has to do with the location of the drone cells in the nest. So we talked about how drones are raised in larger cells. So how does that work? So if you let bees make their own comb and they don't have foundation, they're amazing little architects. And what they'll do is they'll create smaller cells in the center where they'll raise worker brood, and then they'll make larger and larger cells, and they'll raise the drone brood on the sides and underneath. And then these larger cells will also have pollen and honey up in the corners. So we know that workers, the survival rate's higher in workers, and the 2 factors are temperature and food. So this construction, it makes sense, right? Because who's going to get more food? Probably the workers in the middle. Remember when we used to go to restaurants, and if you sat like next to back in the corner, you might not get as much attention from the servers. But if you're right in the middle of the restaurant, you get more food, the workers get more food. And then also in terms of temperature, if there's a cold snap, the drones actually they're going to feel the cold more than the workers. And what's interesting about this is the drones are actually insulating the more important worker sisters. So even in their infancy, they're serving the good of the colony by insulating the more important workers, which is really interesting when you think about it. Okay, so if you use foundation, the workers are going to be desperate to find room to raise make drone-sized cells, and they'll typically make it on the bottoms of frames between the boxes. And drones can be raised on worker foundation. You'll see them popping out, but they will be smaller. And a bigger drone is a healthier drone, and they have more semen. So it's really better to have them raised in larger cells. And this is a picture of, I use all medium frames, and this is the worker brood in the center, and the drone brood, it looks like bubble wrap. When you let them make their own cells, they're kind of popping out like this. So drone rearing generally happens during a nectar flow, but at all times, the colony is constantly evaluating where to put their resources. So even if it's a nectar flow, and they're raising lots of drones, and there's something happens. Say there's a cold snap or it rains for 2 weeks straight and the resources change. The workers will they'll cull the eggs and larvae, and they'll even uncap and rip out pupae if they can't afford that. And this cannibalism is called brood trimming. And they'll even trim the brood of workers. Do you ever get a new queen and you put her in kind of a small colony and she's just laying like crazy, and if there aren't enough nurse bees to take care of it, those workers are just going to gobble up those eggs. And what's fascinating to me about that is all the feedback mechanisms that are in place in a colony at any given time. How does one worker know what her sisters are doing? How does she know it's okay for her to eat these eggs, and so that the whole system works together? It's just kind of mind-blowing when you think about how colonies are communicating in there. Okay, so adult drones, when they emerge, they're fully formed and they have all the equipment they need, but they're still developing in the first few weeks after emergence, and they're not quite ready to mate. So the first day, their cuticle is hardening, so they're just kind of walking around while the cuticle hardens. And for the first week, they can't feed themselves. They pretty much are fed by nurse bees, which they feed them the regurgitation. They regurgitate the contents of their stomach. That's what they get. And then for days 1 through 12, the reproductive organs are maturing. They emerge with everything they need, but the semen has to move from the testes to the seminal vesicles. And this is pretty much done by day 12. Day 6 through 9, they take their orientation and cleansing flights. And between day 12 and 18, they're ready to make their first attempts at mating flights. So drones pretty much have one job, and very few drones that are raised are going to get to fulfill this ultimate destiny. And that job is to mate with queens from other colonies. So let's look at how drones are equipped for their one job and how they differ from workers. Compared to workers, drones are lacking in many ways. They have tiny mandibles compared to workers because, you know, they don't need to manipulate propolis or manipulate comb or chew wood or do anything like that. All they need their mandibles for is to rip open cells to drink honey out of. They do have pheromones from their mandibular glands. So they have a short proboscis. Again, they don't need long tongues to mine nectar out of flowers. They just have to be able to drink from a honey cell. And they don't have pollen collecting structures on their legs for obvious reasons. They have a slender crop. They don't need that extra honey stomach that workers need to bring nectar home. And they don't have wax, hypopharyngeal, or nasal glands. And what makes them really fun to play with is they don't have a sting gland, so they can't sting you. If you want to freak out your friends and family who don't know about bees, grab a few drones and put them up under your veil while you're working, and they'll be like, "Oh my God, there's a bee on your face," and you'll be like, "Oh no, I'm chill. It's no big deal. Bees don't bother me." Okay, so let's look at how they are equipped to carry out their job. Their antennae have 10 times the olfactory plate of workers, and we all know what great sniffers workers are, you know, because they can smell and distinguish between nectar sources while they're flying. Well, drones can smell 10 times better, and they need to be able to smell really well in order to smell that queen pheromone when they're flying. They have much larger compound eyes. It almost looks like they're going to touch in the middle of their head. Their eyes have 8,600 facets versus 6,900 for workers. The optic lobes of their brain are much larger in order to process all that information that's coming in with those big eyes. They have broader wings, and they have larger flight muscles to propel those wings. So, do you know what's on this slide? This is bees mating in the sky, and there's nothing on it because it is literally impossible to see with a naked eye. Honeybees are unique in their mating behavior in that they're mating on the wing or while they're flying 12 to 15 miles an hour. And because of this, it's been really difficult to study. For a long time, you know, many years ago, the people thought maybe they didn't mate at all because you can't see the drone's reproductive organs, right? So it wasn't really until researchers figured out how to attach a kite to a virgin that they could where they could film it and really understand what was happening in mating, because you can't get bees to mate in a lab. They won't do it unless they're flying. So what happens is honeybees mate in areas called drone congregation areas, or DCAs, and these are discrete areas about 30 to 200 meters in diameter, where drones from many different colonies gather together and they fly around looking for queens to mate with. And while they're flying, the air is filling with the drone's mandibular pheromones, which is going to help other drones find the DCAs and also queens to find the DCAs. And drones from one colony will visit different DCAs at the same time, and any individual drone can visit several DCAs in the same day. It's sort of like bar hopping, right? Drones can fly only for about 30 minutes before they have to refuel. So depending on how far they fly and how hot it is, depends on how much time they can spend in a DCA. If they're close by, they might be able to fly around the DCA for 20 minutes, but 15 minutes is kind of typical. So drones leave the nest and go on these mating flights in the afternoons. The books say between 1 and 4 or 12 and 3, but often in warmer climates like where I am, it's really 3 to 7. I was talking to a woman who did some research in Florida, and she was saying she was setting up traps to find DCAs, and she almost abandoned her research because she was looking between 1 and 3 or 12 and 3, and in Florida and in Atlanta they really don't start flying until 3, so then they'll fly until 7 o'clock at night. So the climate has a lot to do with the times that they fly. But the DCAs are quite mysterious, and they're mysterious because they remain constant, these sites, year after year. Now, the drones die out in the winter because the workers are only going to raise them when they can be of use. And as soon as mating season's over, it's all about surviving the winter. So they're going to kick all those drones out in the fall. And so there's no intergenerational learning. We know that drones don't come back and do dances. They don't teach other drones where the DCAs are. So it's kind of mysterious that the drones can find these spots and that they come back to the same ones year after year. There's one, a DCA in Sheffield, England, that is said to have bees in it since 1722. Isn't that crazy? And they also, when they're in a DCA, they stay in this area. If you go even a few meters out, they won't follow you. If you have a lure or you have a virgin queen, they won't follow, which is kind of crazy. So even though they're mysterious and there's a lot we don't know about it, there are some cues that people have observed about DCAs. And one is that they tend to be depressions in the landscape. So if you could kind of fly up from your apiary and look out, they look in the landscape and they sort of head downhill. So they look for depressions. And often when they're traveling and there's suddenly a drop, that might be a place where you'll find a DCA. There are visual cues such as like tree lines that they might follow, or intersections of tree lines, rivers, things like that they can see aerially. Sometimes DCAs have a windbreak. So you'll read that there's like an open area that's lined by trees, or an open field with cliffs, or a parking lot with a tall building. It's easier to mate when it's not terribly windy. So a windbreak is sometimes there in DCAs. And there's also a possibility that DCAs happen where there are magnetic anomalies in the earth. We know that all honeybees have iron particles in their abdomens, and workers will use magnetism to orient. It's not their main mode, but they do use it. So this is definitely a possibility as well. The paths that drones take to get to DCAs are called flyways. And on the right is a map of DCAs and flyways in Arizona from a study done by Gerald Loper using radar. And so you can like literally see where all the drones were going and where they were and how they got there. The dots are DCAs and the lines in between are flyways. And if you could see this in better detail, you'd see that the flight paths align with roadways and tree lines, and often the DCAs occur in intersections of like where another bank of trees comes in along a road line. However, we know that there are DCAs over forested areas and water that don't really have these visual cues. So there's just a lot we don't know about DCAs. So drones fly around in the DCAs, and once they spot and smell a queen, they're going to gather in like a comet-like formation and chase the virgin queen. And the strongest, fastest drone is going to reach her and mate with her first, while they're flying in the air about 12 to 15 miles an hour. Now, given the opportunity, bees will mate in the flyways, but inbreeding is not good for honeybees. And so the mating process has evolved some really interesting checks to put in place to keep inbreeding to a minimum. And what happens is when the drones leave the nest, they fly up about 26 meters high and they head out on their way. And they're going to go to DCAs that are closer to home, because remember, they only have 30 minutes, right? They got to get out there, cruise for chicks, and head back, fuel up, and go again. So they're going to stay closer to home. And when they get to a DCA, they're going to fly up as much as 75 meters above the ground, look for queens, come back down, and go home. And the workers and queens actually typically fly up about 8 meters high and head out on their way. And the queen is going to go farther away before she heads up into a DCA. And when she gets to a DCA, there are going to be thousands of drones there. She'll have plenty of drones to mate with. So she can afford to spend her time flying farther away, because it's going to happen really fast and she can fly back. So the drones are going to go higher and go stick close to home. The queens are going to fly farther away and then head up into a DCA. So this distance while they're in the flyways keeps inbreeding down. Isn't that crazy? It just kind of blows my mind that this mechanism has evolved. It's fascinating. Okay, so honeybee copulation is a complicated thing. And already I've mentioned that it's done mid-flight, on the go. So a queen has found a DCA, and because of her strong pheromones, she soon attracts a comet of drones chasing her, and the drones are going to approach her from below. And once contact is made, it only takes a few seconds for mating to happen. This is a page from Mark Winston's biology book that illustrates the copulation. So inside the drone's barrel-shaped abdomen, he has his endophallus. It's this complicated structure, and it's folded up inside. And in order to mate, he has to mount the queen. He grabs her with his first 2 pairs of legs. And at this point, in order to be successful, the queen has to open her sting chamber. And not all drones who get this far are successful. I like to point out that bees figured out consent long before the humans did. So if she doesn't open her sting chamber, he doesn't mate. But when she does open her sting chamber, he grabs her then with all 6 legs. He everts the endophallus into the queen's sting chamber. And this action flips him backwards and paralyzes him. His ejaculation happens when the pressure of the drone's hemolymph makes his abdomen contract, and he snaps backward. His endophallus breaks off, and part of it's left behind in the queen's sting chamber, and he falls to his death. And this whole thing takes like literally 2 seconds. Like it's just boom, it happens. And if you're standing underneath, it makes an audible popping noise that humans can sometimes hear, which is kind of crazy, right? So now the work of that drone is done, and the queen will mate with many more drones on that day. Often you'll hear that the average queen mates with 12 to 20 drones, but it can be upwards of 50 or 60 drones. The better that people are getting at measuring this, the numbers are really much higher than I think we often read in the books. And this multiple mating is really important for strong colonies. If you have a queen that only mated with a few drones, that colony is doomed. A well-mated queen is going to have so much genetic diversity that there are workers who are able to do all kinds of tasks that when you only have, a lot fewer fathers, then your colony is just not going to be nearly as successful and probably not survive long. So about 70% of the time, when a queen returns from her mating flight, she's going to still have the endophallus of the last drone in her sting chamber. And we call this the mating sign. And see this orange bit? So it's this bright orange color, and because the bees can see, colors that we can't see, it's pretty bright to us, but to them it's really bright. So it's probably another visual cue when the drones are coming in to mate behind their fellows, when the next one comes in, it's a good way for him to kind of line up to get going. So that doesn't happen all the time. It happens about 70% of the time. And queens can go for more than one mating flight. So say she heads out and she, the weather turns, or for whatever reason takes her too long to get to the DCA, she will go home and maybe go on another mating flight, but she's typically done within just a couple days. So the drones that don't get lucky and die will fly around for half an hour, come back, drink up a bunch of honey, and set back out again, maybe going to several different DCAs in an afternoon. But if mating doesn't kill him, as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, the workers will. If resources are scarce or in a dearth, as I said, workers will refuse them entrance back into the hive. But in the fall, when mating season is over, they will kick out the remaining drones. So there are typically no old drones in the hive. Because drones can't sting you, they make great little test subjects for queen marking. So if you've wanted to mark your queens, but you're worried, trepidatious, you should be, because it's kind of stressful, but you can practice, holding them by the thorax. You can practice painting drones. It's kind of a fun thing to do too. And then once you're comfortable doing that, you can mark your queens. And I'm a big advocate for letting your colonies have drones. I talked a lot earlier about how they have this drive to raise drones. And this is usually the point in the program where people are like, what about the mites? Because we all know that those Varroa love drone comb. And yeah, I'm with you on that. But it doesn't mean that you can't let your colonies raise drones. You just have to, keep an eye on what's happening with your mite loads. This green drone comb is actually made to do something called drone trapping for Varroa control. It's a natural Varroa control. So you put this in, you let them raise, 7,000 drones. Once they cap it, you pull it out and put it in the freezer. And then the mites tend to go in the drone comb before they go in the worker comb. But what I encourage you to do before you just go ahead and freeze it is take your capping scratcher and just kind of run it across a little area up here and pull out some pupae and look at it. And if it's riddled with Varroa, yeah, then you've got a problem. But if it's not, let them have their drones. You don't have to buy a fancy green comb though. You can take a shallow frame or a medium and put it in a deep box, and they will gladly raise drone comb on the bottom. Or you can even just pop the foundation out completely on a frame. And so long as you put it between two fully drawn brood combs, they will draw out the comb and they will raise drones in it. So if you're using foundation anyway, this is what I'm talking about. If you don't use foundation, they will, make as much drone comb as they need. And what I find is that they will make drone comb, and then they'll later use that to store honey in those bigger cells, which is a more efficient space for honey anyway. But you can do that to let them have their drones. And I want to mention on a sad note that neonicotinoid exposure makes drone sperm counts 39% lower, which is really depressing. And I'm all for banning neonicotinoids, and I encourage your club to contribute to the Pollinator Stewardship Council. That's the work that that organization does, is fighting pesticides on behalf of bees and beekeepers. So how do you find your drone congregation areas? I know you're all dying to know. The way it has been done for a long time is by using weather balloons. So this is actually a weather balloon up here, and it looks tiny, but it's about 5 feet in diameter, which is crazy. And this is my buddy Courtney, and she's got a kite string, and she's sort of, you feel like you're flying a kite when you're doing this. And this takes 2 people. So on this day, I was back here with the camera and also with the binoculars, because one person sort of has to shepherd the balloon, and then another person takes binoculars and looks for bees. It is kind of hard to do by yourself, to do both things. So in this particular spot was the textbook DCA should have been, right? So I looked on Google Maps before I went out. This is a soccer field not too far from my house. Open area, tree lined, windbreak. It was a completely still day, and we did not see a single bee. And then we moved on to a couple of other spots and didn't see a single bee. And it was pretty depressing. You feel like you're looking for a needle in a haystack anyway. But what you might not know is that there is a worldwide helium shortage. And so to fill up a weather balloon like that takes almost $50. And I thought, well, I'll just keep flying it until the helium runs out. And I walked outside, I left it on my front porch, and I walked outside in the morning and it was dead on the ground. So I thought there's got to be a better way. And so enter this kind of drone. So just to keep from being confusing, when I say drones, I'm talking about these handsome fellows. And when I'm talking about this mechanical drone, I'm going to call it a UAV, for unmanned aerial vehicle. So this is my UAV, and this is some lure hanging down here, and I've tied it to the feet with a piece of thin thread. And I recommend using this thin thread because my first instinct was, oh, I'll go get fishing line, but I have a friend of mine who is a professional drone pilot who was getting into beekeeping, and so we kind of did a trade, and he mentored me in flying this device, and I mentored him with beekeeping. And I was like, should I get fishing line? And he was like, no, you want thin cotton thread, because if it gets caught on something, better to break the thread and you lose a couple bucks in lure than crash your expensive UAV. So the lure that I recommend using is this artificial QMP. The brand name is Temp Queen, and you can get it at the bee suppliers. It's actually made for when you have a queenless colony and you have ordered a queen, but you don't want the workers to start generating eggs and turning into laying workers. So you put this pheromone in there, and it kind of keeps that from happening. But it works great. You keep it in the freezer. It's a few bucks each, and it can last a really long time. And that's the sex attractant pheromone. So there are several things. The lemongrass, which is also smells like queens, is not the sex attractant queen. So it's the QMP. And you need something to attach the lure to, and something that has a little bit of weight so that it dangles. So you want it to weigh between 7 and 10 grams. I found works pretty well. It's not too heavy. And these hair rollers work great, actually, because there's holes in them and the wind can blow through. You just peel off the fuzzy outer layer, and then this is the green tube of lure zip tied in there. And I use some jewelry hardware to attach the thread, just because I'm doing it a lot, but you could just tie it on, thread's cheap. And a friend of mine figured out that she didn't want to go buy some hair rollers. I didn't really think about that. And she just got a pill bottle and drilled holes in it and then attached the lure, which I thought was pretty brilliant. So you can do that too. And when I first started flying, I realized that the propellers generate a lot of wash, a lot of wind, and I didn't want to artificially blow that pheromone around. So I flew, this is me laying in my driveway, and I flew my UAV up until I didn't feel any more wind on my face. And it was about 20 feet up. So I try to dangle my lure about 22 feet below the UAV whenever possible. So where are you going to look? There's a great tool called Google Earth Pro, and it has this cool feature. You can go in right here and exaggerate the terrain. And what that does is whenever there's a drop off, it exaggerates it. And I have been pretty lucky finding DCAs where there's sort of some kind of drop off. So this is a free tool. It used to be expensive. It's not Google Earth Pro, and you want to go in and do that. And that's the name of it there, Google Earth Pro. And as I mentioned earlier, the time of day is important. That they fly later here than we thought. But if you can be patient, if you find a few sites, you might spend 5 minutes flying in an area, and then maybe go check something else, and then circle back, like once every 30 minutes to an hour in the same places, because the drones might just show up a little later than you had gone out, or a little earlier. I don't know what's happening in California with the DCAs. But be patient and go back to the same places. And I also really recommend, if you think you found one, to definitely go back on subsequent days and make sure that you have. So when I first started flying, I saw this is an apartment complex near my house. I was super excited. I thought it was a DCA. And even though it was kind of uncomfortable because I would have to fly over the pool, and I know the people there probably thought it was some you know, creepy kid trying to look at bikinis, but it was just an old lady beekeeper. Anyway, if you see, you know, a handful of drones, if you see tens of 10 or, you know, 20 drones, that's most likely a flyway and not a Dca. A Dca is going to be churning with hundreds and hundreds of drones. And I've also been, you know, I was at a flying just in neighbors' yards down the street, and one day I saw, you know, a decent number of drones in somebody's front yard, and I went back day after day and I never found any there again. So I think it was pretty close to my house. It was probably just, you know, a peripheral flyway. But when you do find a drone, it is amazing and glorious to see. So I hope this, I never know how well it's going to come across on the internet. But another great thing about having the lure so low, you see these little white specks down close to the lure, but you also see all the drones flying out. And if you look carefully, you can sort of see them trailing. And I hope I don't make you nauseated. But also, I just want to point out that this is a really strong Dca, that, you know, this is not really an open field with a windbreak, right? This is over trees, and there's more of an opening area up here, but they tend to stick around these trees. And this lot right here, this Dca, is 2 lots over from that soccer field that I talked about earlier. And I flew so many times in that soccer field because it seemed like the textbook Dca, but it wasn't. So one thing that I find interesting about using the UAV is a lot of the Dcas that I found are over forested areas. And I wonder how much of that saying, oh, well, it's in an open area, is just because that's the only place you can walk with a weather balloon. And I don't think I mentioned this, but the other thing that researchers have done besides use a weather balloon is a pole, like have a pole with lure at the top and walk around. But again, you can't take a pole on top of a tree, right? So, okay, so this is my baby, my citizen science project. It's a website called Map My Dca. And on this website, so I launched this in November 2019 after figuring out how to use the UAV to find Dcas. And I wanted there to be some place for all this data to be collected. So on this website, you can read about drones and pretty much go through and about Dcas, how to find a Dca using that method that I just outlined with the hair roller and everything. And then, but on the homepage, you can click on View the Dca Map, and you can look and see where people have pinned Dcas. And it's a worldwide map, but I've just zoomed in here from the screenshot in my neighborhood. And when you roll over a pin, it says details. And when you click on that, you get the data that was uploaded by that user. If you scroll down, here, there's a place for people to put YouTube videos of the flights, and most of the ones that I've pinned, I've put up videos. So if you want to see more Dcas in action, you can go look at some of those. So my hope is that people will fill up the map, and then I'm just going to go back a second. On the home screen, you can click on, okay, nope, sorry, wrong spot. When you're in the map, here it is. You can download all Dca data. So my hope is that it will fill up with lots of Dcas and that it will be useful to researchers in the future to at least have a database. And you could even do something like, you know, just look at Google Maps and survey and look for visual cues, or see what percentage are over forested areas versus open areas and stuff like that. So so that's the idea, is just to, it's a data collecting site. And I've had people register from all over the world, really, but not that many people have actually pinned Dcas. So I'm trying to get the word out and hope, I mean, it is kind of a fun thing to do. And I think it'd be interesting, you know, especially if you're a queen breeder, to know where your Dcas are. But even if you're, I mean, I'm not a queen breeder, but I just think it's fascinating. So anyway, one thing that I don't address on my website is how to responsibly pilot a UAV. You really have to know what you're doing, because if you fly over, you know, it's actually illegal to fly down a road, because you could crash and create a, you know, car accident. So I'm not even going to try to teach people how to fly these things. It's important that you educate yourself and follow your local ordinances. I have, this is the UAV that I have, and it's a pretty nice one. I could tie the thread to the feet down here. I do recommend, if whatever one you get, though, that you get one that has, it doesn't have to have a screen with a controller like this. Sometimes you can use your iPad or your phone, but you need something so that you can actually see what the camera is seeing. Otherwise, I bought a like $50 UAV on Amazon just to see if it would do the trick, and it didn't have any kind of remote screen that I could see. So you'd really have to film the whole time you were flying and then come back and put the chip in your computer and watch what happened. And I just don't think that would be, because you have short flight time, so you wouldn't be able to cover much, and it would just be frustrating. You need to be able to see what you're doing. Now, these mini drones are really popular now. And the nice thing about those is that they are they're so light that they often don't qualify as aircraft, so there are fewer regulations. But if you're going to use one like this, I recommend you get, this is some like attachment landing gear stuff that you can attach so that you have something to attach the thread to that's well out of the way of the propellers. I wouldn't want to attach the thread right here. It would make me nervous that it would get caught in the propellers. And then, so in Georgia anyway, and I don't really know how many of these rules are federal and how many are local, but you're allowed to fly over private property. It's not illegal so long as you yourself aren't trespassing. So you can stand in the street and fly over your neighbor's house. But, you might not be met with, you might not be welcomed. Just because it's legal doesn't mean that people are going to be nice about it. So I was flying in a neighborhood, really like a mile from my house one day, and I was standing in a cul-de-sac and flying over the houses, and then I was just getting ready to finish, and this pickup truck pulled up beside me, and he's like, "What are you doing?" There was no hello or anything, and I'm like, "Hey, listen, I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I'm gonna land my UAV and get out of here. I'm actually doing some honeybee research." And he was like, "What do you mean honeybee research?" And I'm like, "Listen, I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I was on my way out anyway." And he was like, "No, just tell me what you're doing." So I told him a little bit about my project. And as people will do, he was like, "Oh, well, I know a beekeeper." And I was like, "Yeah, who's the beekeeper? You never know, I might know them." And he was like, "No, you don't know her. She doesn't live in Atlanta. She lives up in Cumming. I know her from kayaking." And I said, "Oh, I bet that's Kelly Campbell." And he was like, "Well, it is Kelly Campbell." And I'm like, "Yeah, I love Kelly. She's great." And I'm like, so I was trying to, make my way out. And then he was kind of like, "Well, you could take a picture of my house with that drone and email it to me." So I flew up and took his business card so I could send him a picture, but it was a mile away, and I hadn't even gotten home before I get this text from my friend Kelly with a screenshot of her conversation with this guy. And she says, "Is this you, Law?" And what he said was, "Some bee lady was flying drone over a house today saying she was looking for male honeybees zooming over my treetops. WTF. She said she knew you, so I figured she had to be cool, so I didn't shoot her." Now, I live in the South where people have lots of guns, but, you just want to be careful. You always keep in mind that you're, in anything you're doing, you're an ambassador for beekeepers, and, just be friendly. Land your UAV if people are nervous. Once you explain what you're doing, they're usually fine. My UAV, a little mentor instructor, guys, he's a big old nerd, and he wears a fluorescent yellow vest, and he swears it helps, but I cannot bring myself to don the fluorescent yellow vest. So I'll just have to keep trying to be polite about it. If you don't, flying a UAV is too, you're just not interested in it. A lot of people have them, they're hobbies, and they want something to do, they want a reason to fly. So you can always reach out. I just Googled drone clubs, and I came out, instantly there were like 3 drone meetups and clubs in my area. And you could reach out to some associations and tell them that, what you're interested in. And another reason to do this, even if you're not going to find somebody who wants to fly around with some lure, is to ask them if they ever encounter a bunch of bees to let you know, because the YouTube is rife with videos of killer bees attacked my drone, and they are actually attracted to the motors, like they will fly up around it, and some of them will get chopped up, but not a lot. But to the layperson, they think it's a swarm, but swarms never fly 75 meters high, right? They're drones, they're drone congregationary. So they might have stumbled across the DCA and not know what it was. So whenever I meet somebody who's like flying a drone, I'll go talk to them and I say, "If you ever come across a bunch of bees, send me, give me a call and tell me where it was. And then you could go out and check it out. And, they call them drones because of the roar they make when they're flying. And I have been in DCAs where there were so many drones, you could hear this hum, and it's a glorious sound. But if someone tells you that they encountered a bunch of bees in a place, go hang out there in the afternoon and see if you can see them and hear them, which is a cool thing to do. So that is the end of my talk. This is the website, mapmydca.com. This is my email. If you have any questions, you can follow me on the things. I'm at mapmydca.com, and I'd be more than happy to answer questions if you all have them.
All right. Thank you so much, Julia. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. Awesome. So I don't have any questions posted yet. If you guys would like to ask questions, here comes one. So please post questions in chat or in the Q&A section. I'll look for them both in both areas. If you would like to ask your question live, just hit the raise hand button, and that will let me know to call on you and turn on your mic. So the first question comes from Andrew Castro. Besides being very interesting to watch, is there any benefit to finding DCAs for a new beekeeper?
No. I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's fascinating. I think it's interesting to know. I don't know. If you have hives and you have drones, they're going to have drone congregation areas. And a lot of times they're really close. They can be just like 1/8 of a mile from your apiary. But not really. I mean, no.
Yeah. So maybe a second or third year beekeeping activity. Maybe first year concentrate on how to.
I don't know. I mean, if you think it's interesting, go.
Yeah, do it. You can do it now.
Yeah. I think if you're a queen breeder, really the only reason why you would want to know where your DCAs are as a beekeeper is if you were a queen breeder and you're trying to flood the area with a certain genetics, right? So you would go between 1/4 and 1.5 miles out and, flood a radius. I get that question a lot, but it's just interesting. And you could contribute to citizen science by putting that data up on there. Yeah.
Totally. All right, Ala, do you want to ask your question next? I just gave you can unmute.
Yeah, I do have a question. Julia, you said that drones are always young. And I thought that drones die only when bees kick them out at the end of summertime. So when they were born, they live like all summertime and going from hive to hive. So what am I wrong?
Yeah, they live, the average is 22 to 32 days is the lifespan. And, just like workers, they wear themselves out flying around, and there is a lot of drift. And I think sometimes one of the reasons why there's drift is because if they are being kicked out, if one colony is suffering and the next colony is like, sure, come on in. But they can drift as much as 5 miles away, which is kind of crazy, right? Yeah, they know they don't, and that's why they will raise the most drones in the spring, but colonies will raise drones a little bit over the summer, and then there's sort of a little fall push. So I read somewhere that a typical colony will raise 2,000 drones in the spring and then another 500 right before fall. So there's sort of another little late mating season, and that must have been in a temperate climate. I'm not really sure where it was, and I don't really know about where you all are, but no, they are pretty young, and they are raised all summer long, just in fewer quantities. So they don't live all summer until the fall.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ala. Phil asks, why do you find drones in a swarm?
Well, they want to get away from their mother too. I don't know. They you do find drones in a swarm, and I think it's probably I don't know. They if they swarm in spring, and that's when there's lots of drones, and we don't really know why, but we know that there are often lots of drones in a swarm. Yeah, they are.
Cool. Oliver asks, what is the typical distance between DCAs?
That's a great question, and maybe we'll know more when the map's kind of fleshed out, but they can be they can be, the ones that I've mapped out in my neighborhood are like a quarter of a mile spaced, and it has to do a lot with the population in the area. So if there are a lot of colonies, you're going to have more and they'll be closer together than if there aren't as many. So, I would say every eighth to quarter of a mile, as much as that, or it could be, 3/4 of a mile. It really just depends on the population density at the hives. Mhm.
Got it. Denise asks, one of my hives seems to have giant drones. You mentioned this was a sign of healthy drones. Were you referring to genetic health creating a bigger drone?
Not really genetic health, but we know that bigger drones have more semen and they also have bigger muscles and they can fly more. So I did a study last summer where I trapped drones and I marked them in 2 different drone congregation areas with 2 different colors paint, and then I kept trapping them to see if they were going to and they were. But I was fascinated that the ones that ended up in the trap were like, some of them were monsters. I mean, they were just huge. They seemed bigger than the typical drones that you see in the colony. So there's definitely some flight power behind them too. But I wouldn't think, I mean, drones only have 1 set of chromosomes, so they're kind of, they're passing on the 1 set of DNA that they have. So I don't think that they have more diversity so much as just that they're more vigorous.
Got it.
Bigger.
I have a follow-up question for myself. So I've noticed I use foundation in my hives, and I tend to use worker foundation. I do have some drone foundation that I'm going to try using this year, but I've noticed that sometimes you'll see drone comb in worker sized cells. And I imagine, and I've also seen smaller drones and larger drones coming out of my hive. So I've, often assumed that those smaller drones were probably laid in worker comb.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. The bigger drones will come out of bigger comb. And worker foundation, I don't know if you know, it's the size it is, which is bigger than workers' cells they'll make, and if you let them do it themselves, because sometime in the 50s, they thought if they had bigger workers, they could better get the nectar out of clover blossoms. And so they made them, whatever it is, a millimeter wider, and it worked. And they were bigger and they have bigger tongues, but it's totally because of that. That's why we have the size worker cell foundation that we have. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, so
that is crazy. I remember hearing that, totally. Phil asks, how many drone frames should I put in a 2 deep colony?
Are you using 10 frame?
Here, Phil, I'm gonna let you talk just a second. While we are getting Phil's mic turned on, I'll ask the next question, which is, have drone antenna been clipped to see how much they depend on finding DCA and mating versus those big eyes? So I guess like trying to determine whether or not it's the antenna or the eyes.
It's the antenna, because finding the DCA, they need their eyes to find the queens, right? But they need to smell. The air is churning with a drone mandibular pheromone, and so when they get there, they can smell it. So I don't know about clipping I'm sure they've done all kinds of things to the poor fellows. I don't think I've read that specifically, but we know that the air is churning with drone mandibular pheromone. There's a theory that that pheromone somehow sinks to the earth, and that might be something that helps them year after year, but then that wouldn't really make sense if the drones went away altogether. But so I think it is the antennae and not necessarily the eyes. And he needs the eyes to spot the queens. Yeah. So Phil, I would say put in 1 frame, and I usually put in 1 frame, and if I use foundation, I put 1 frame in a 10 frame box of a deep. And if they don't need to raise drones, or they can't afford it, they'll just fill it with honey. So I'd put it towards the outside. And if you really wanted to go gangbusters, you could if you got 2 deeps, you could put 1 frame in each.
Okay.
And in the wild, Tom Seeley says they'll make 15% drone comb. So you can do the calculus if you want, but typically that's what I would do, is put 1 frame in a deep. And if you're doing double deeps, you could put 2.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Phil. Carol asks, do drones leave the hive daily just to get out, or only when they want to breed?
They want to breed every day. So they, you know, that's their job. I'm serious. They're not thinking about, we think workers are just kind of lolling around when they're out, but they're looking for something. Workers are looking for water, nectar, or propolis, and drones, that's their one job. There is a little bit of evidence that they actually do contribute by vibrating their thoraces and maybe helping heat the hive a little bit. So that's sort of new, but that's their one job. And so they go on cleansing flights, right? And they go out and they go on their orientation flights just like workers do, but they pretty much just fly to cruise for chicks. Yeah.
Cool. And David asks, have you thought about hanging a microphone from the UVA and recording and analyzing the sound to find DCAs?
I had someone ask me about getting some super sensitive microphone to walk around on the ground and see if you could perceive the sound, but I hadn't thought about hanging a microphone. The UAV generates some noise, which is not really a great thing, because it's fascinating that you got this lure down there. It's like, this is the queen down there, but they are always a contingent up around, kind of almost batting the UAV because they're flying into that wind. And I find it looks like defensive behavior, which we don't think of drones as being defensive, but we don't know, you could have different behavior outside than up there. But that's a good idea. I just don't know how the wind would affect it, but that's a good idea. I'll have to look into that.
Cool.
Mhm.
I think that was the last question. Julia, thank you so much for staying up until 11 o'clock your time.
That's so late.
We really appreciate it. This was an amazing talk, very interesting, and your slides are awesome. Like, those drawings are so cool. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. If you are a member, feel free to stick around. I'm going to go through some announcements and then we'll do the raffle. But Julia, feel free to drop off. I know it's so late there.
Okay. Good night, y'all. Thanks.
night.
Thank you.
All right. I'm just going to stop the recording now, and then I will go through the announcements.